to know that when I say curtains for endangered species, this is not a sort of has the panda had its day sort of reference. I'm not saying let's give up on all endangered species. I'm literally talking about curtains and wallpaper that benefit and tell stories about endangered species. This is a cactus design of mine, Cactus mexicanus. But in order to tell you the story, I want to go back to the sort of beginning of my relationship with dice, which goes back 25 years, I think, which makes it quite nice that I've been invited back. I was living in Latin America, had been for a number of years, and I made the pilgrimage all the way back to the United Kingdom. I very much wanted to work with legendary Professor Untitled Williams, who is here this evening, who was really a pioneer on working on human-animal conflict, which was what I wanted to look at with this species, because they do run into a lot of trouble with people. Where I wanted to study them was in the Andes. It was all very ill-advised. It was remote. It was cold, steep, muddy, wet, and difficult. But Nigel was willing to take a punt on me and steered my PhD in an admirable fashion, despite the fact that it was very problematic. I ended up spending 2 years there. I was intending to do the first sort of radiotelemetry study of the bears. In fact, for a long time, I wasn't able to trap one, and I had to collect a lot of data on the same sort of thing people had done before, the baseline. This is poo, these are the field markings, these are maternity dens, scratch marks, and so on. I was ultimately, to cut a very long story short, able to radio collar the first wild bears of the species. They were very good to me. I had a sample size of 2, which I think is probably a record. I don't know if anybody's got a PhD with a sample size of 2 in history. On the top slide there, you might be able to see me with my radio telemetry receiver. I had to spend a lot of time trying to track these guys and find out what their activity patterns and movements were. But in the cloud forest environment, it's difficult conditions because those clouds, all the photos I have, everything looks clear, but the clouds come up the valley very early in the morning and it becomes very difficult to see. So that, I think, had some effect, which is relevant to what I'm doing now today. Added to the fact that I lived in a cave for quite a long time. I think of all the hundreds of thousands of people in the interiors industry that I interface with on a regular basis, I think I'm the only one who spent any time living in a cave. And after that, I had this small little hut built according to modern biophilic design principles of all materials, just from that very close environment around me on the hill there. I had a flower press, and I had my binoculars. I had a little piece of plastic, was the only bit of something that wasn't natural that was in the house, and it gave me a skylight where I had my library, and I was able to keep my books and do my illustrations and pore over the birds of the high Andes, which was this wonderful book that I had there. I'd like to ask you all a question. When you've been doing your field research, could I have a show of hands, not just field research, everybody who's been in a field, been outside in nature at all, how many people have drawn something from their environment? Oh, you surprised me. Nice. Nothing.
No.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nigel?
Photographed.
Photographed.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
yes. Well, I'm here to tell you that you must try it because it's wonderful. I did quite a lot of illustration. I never had any art training or anything, but I found it pretty wonderful to bring these things home and really study them. I had no radio, TV, electricity, communication, and I was on my own a lot. So the contemplation of this environment and all the marvels of beauty there made me feel like I was a modern day Maria Sibylla Merian. And she is a rock star. If you don't know her, really look her up. She was born around 1650, and she went off to Suriname and was one of the first people to document the metamorphosis of an insect, and she was an incredible artist. This is Alberta Sieber, who's roughly contemporaneous in Amsterdam, who did the early Cabinet of Curiosities collection. Wonderful man called Sidney Parkinson, died at 26 and did the 1,000 illustrations for the Florilegium of Joseph Banks going on James Cook's voyages. And Marianne North in Kew, if you've ever been there, she was revolutionary for painting the full context of all the species that she documented. And I love all that. I've always absolutely adored all of that. And all you do is you go out there with your little pen and you feel connected to this world of scientists, artists. This is Ernst Haeckel, who many of you may be aware of, absolutely genius man in so many ways, and also wonderful at creating a sort of patterns that made what he was studying that much more interesting and alluring. Many of you, certain members of the audience, I think, know this gentleman. Yeah. This is Jonathan Kingdon, who is in my estimation, an absolute god in terms of these things. Hello, Brett. He is, he's an extraordinary artist. He learned to draw before his mum taught him to draw before he learned to read, and he has an extraordinarily synthetic mind of ideas, and his process of analytical drawing, of studying as he draws, and that feedback of studying the forms has informed his rather extraordinary output through the years. Definitely look him up if you don't know him, Jonathan Kingdon. Jack Ashby from Cambridge, there was a recent exhibition when I went to see Nigel recently, and he was writing about Jonathan Kingdon. This is one of a million quotes about science and art, but I quite liked it. The division between the arts and sciences, which education seems built around today, which only really became ingrained in the 19th century, is artificial. Both are deeply creative and both are thoroughly analytical. And I personally feel that it's important that all students of science feel turned on to and aware of and unlocked in terms of engaging creatively and artistically with their subject matter, in the same way that I'm always on at people who are artistic about opening their eyes to science and how easy it is to engage with it these days. Oh dear, what a disappointing font, but I'm going to move on. So for the, you must forgive me if I'm offensive here, but for the gentlemen in the audience, particularly those who are hampered not only by being male, but also by being heterosexual, pattern is not always, the charms of pattern are not always manifestly evident. And I wanted to do a little sort of potted course on why pattern is really, really nice for a lot of women. There may be men amongst you who think pattern is wonderful, but if you don't, I'm going to just give you a little quick overview. This is a chap called Christopher Marley. Dickensian name, that, isn't it? But I think that is really his name. And he described his pattern making thus. He said, "I have found that when my subjects are meticulously composed, it makes the translation more intelligible for the public at large, just as random music notes, once properly orchestrated, can enter the heart and sway it almost against our volition." And that's the kind of effect that pattern has on those of us that are receptive to it. It's like the difference between I've often thought this, I was surprised to see him say the same thing. It's like the refrains of music is calming and moving to people. In the same way, pattern, repeating pattern is moving to many people who love it. I will just have a little side note there to say it's my father's fault that I particularly expect men to dislike pattern. He loves a picture of a bird in a frame on a wall. He loves that lovely natural history illustration in a book, and he loves it in a museum, but he doesn't want them creeping all around his walls and on his curtains. Makes him feel deeply, deeply uneasy. But I just wanted to continue my selling of pattern to you, also in terms of human beings as foragers. In our deep evolutionary past, we were 99% of it. We were hunting and gathering. What creature could be more butch than a grizzly bear, I ask you? And they like pattern. They have their head turned. They are charmed by berries arrayed in an even pattern on a bush. Also, army cutworm moths, that 40,000 of which they eat in a day on the underside of boulders, and they are cueing to the visual as well as the olfactory groupings of those things. And we are so much more visual than bears. Similarly, we're foraging like they are. So in our primate evolution, the ability to see fruit arrayed in even, regular ways, to see tall grass and be able to perceive the very tiny difference of a highly camouflaged predator in that environment would mean life and death. And that neurologically then paved the way in our minds to be able to read and perceive tiny encodings. So it's very, very important to us, the reading of pattern. There's so much scholarship on the formation of pattern in nature. Philip Ball has written lots of books. This is a photograph from a recent exhibition at the Francis Crick Institute. These are skin cells of a zebrafish seen through an electron scanning microscope. And if you look at that pattern, Philip Ball would no doubt have a name for that kind of pattern. but you'll see it. I just happened to notice this is the crown shyness in a deciduous forest, the way they give each other, respect each other's personal space, as it were. And then that's remind me of Russell Seymour, Nigel, that's a Rothschild's giraffe, and that same sort of patterning on its body. But those are just pretty randomly picked examples. The pattern in nature is absolutely everywhere, and when you begin to perceive it and exalt in it like I do, it's a real source of fun. But for those of you who aren't convinced, this is Harper Began and Townsend's ecology text, and the very first sentence in it says, "This book is about the distribution and abundance of different types of organism over the face of the earth." And that's pattern. That is what pattern is, the understanding of pattern, and particularly that second drawing there of a regular pattern. That's mainly my business. That's what I do. This is Josef Frank, who's one of my heroes. I don't know if any of you are aware of him, but it's an absolutely wonderful body of design work and a great philosopher about pattern and design. And this, of course, is the great William Morris, deeply butch, obviously, look at that, and yet loved pattern. He said, I must have suggestions of fields and trees and boughs and tendrils, otherwise don't give me your design, I don't want to see it. He loved nature to be burgeoning through in all of his designs, although he was very prescriptive about only wanting stylized animals. And that is interesting for me. I wanted to just show you this just in the way of thinking of pattern making and the appreciation of the distribution of design elements in space. This is a lovely little tiny clip filmed of leaf burst, and it shows something that's very similar. I wish the lights were off, but you can see okay, I guess. What it shows is the way each leaf finds its space and finds its light. And when I'm doing textile design, it's the wonderful kind of mesmeric state that I get into where I'm, mesmerized by the movement and by the finding of the place for the thing that creates the balance. And it's really just like what nature does when it's each little leaf, its success depends upon its finding the perfect position to be in to photosynthesize to the best of its ability. And it always reminds me of this when I'm in that process of having done the design elements, but trying to find the balance of the design. I always think of this beautiful little bit of filming. And this is a William Morris design, which you can see is that full, complete kind of filling of space in a harmonious way that he achieved so well. But the question that came to my mind when I came back from my studies and I was making my home in Whitstable in order to be close to Dice at all times, and I wanted to find representations of wild nature that I could create that kind of dense visual complexity that I was used to from the cloud forest environment in my own home. But I was strangely unable to find it. And looking back into the deep human past, I think this is Altamira, and this is a beautiful cave painting of a European bison. Scooting forward till 2,000 years ago, this is the House of the Golden Bracelet in Pompeii, with very specific illustrations that you can clearly identify as different species. But that's really lost. It seems there were great taboos about that through European traditions of interiors and a lot of textile design also for fashion and whatnot. There were things tended to be stylized and slightly remote, and there were taboos about things about which I'd like to do more research. It's interesting to me. But when I was looking to find things that I wanted in my home that felt harmonious and balanced and also representing the wild, I found things like this. This is an amazing Icelandic artist called Cristiano Williams who does collages. These are collages. And as you can see, it's very maybe kaleidoscopic and whimsical and irreverent. It wasn't what I wanted, although she's an amazing woman and I admire her. This, again, someone else I've now done trade shows with. She's called Helen Wilson. She's an amazing oil painter. And this is a design of hers where she's faithfully rendered these different creatures. The design itself is called Amazonia. You see, no other audience I could speak to would have that reaction. Thank you. So you can understand, my geeky friends, how the two things I really wanted to find in design, I wanted specificity in terms of species. I wanted to be able to identify the species, which I get from this. But I also wanted a kind of ecological context and a sense of reverence for the wild, and that was where I didn't quite manage to find it there. This is another very iconic example. You might have seen this. It's really been hugely successful. It's from House of Hackney. It was a young artist who didn't make nearly enough money out of this print for how much it's made for House of Hackney, I fear. I think it's called Badgers of Bohemia, and you've got, what have you got there? A sloth smoking a hookah pipe. You've got an otter with a feather fan. You've got somebody playing a little banjo lele there, and is that perhaps an aye with an accordion, or no? I don't know.
Bush baby.
Bush baby, yeah, bush baby, you're quite right. But again, this was not what I wanted in terms of, I wanted the flora and the fauna, thank you, but I wanted it to be a little bit more careful and, yeah, kind of reverential of the wild. So 10 years ago, I've got my 25th anniversary of joining DICE, and then 10 years ago, I wrote this funny little Ideas Factory grant, which was really to look into where wild species might have a place within textile design. At that time, I had the idea that I really wanted to work with children's art and children from the sites where different endangered species were found, and I wanted to funnel money back to those communities, blah, blah, blah. It was too complicated. But one thing, I found it on an old computer, and I was delighted to find this particular detail, number 4, provide the details of the intended commercial impact of the project. It says, I said, founded in 1993, Kath Kidston made profits of 33.1 million last year on flowers and polka dots, neither of which benefited from her success, by the way. I would like to be netting 1% of this by the end of the second year after the launch of the enterprise. Assuming the feasibility has positive results, I think a realistic target is 10 million by 2020. But the whole, oh, I've lost my font there, but basically the point of the little quote at the bottom was from the Ideas Factory, that it was all about breaking down barriers, building new relationships to create a world of infinite possibilities, it said. So I guess I was with the spirit of the Ideas Factory in that. But what I did really find through that feasibility study was that there was an opportunity to do a more sort of respectful representation of wild nature in textile industry. It's a big industry. In the UK, 14 billion, another 100 billion or so added to it in the American market. And those are the two countries that I sell the most in, but by the time you extrapolate it out, it's vast and very important in terms of getting things right for sustainability and stuff. But also for me as a conservationist, knowing that the message was already hitting home to the people who were already susceptible to that kind of message. Our dear friend Tanya is not here this evening, I'm sorry to say. I picked this randomly off the internet just to illustrate the sort of conservation communication that is really already out there. We've got a biologist on the left-hand side, and you can tell that you can trust her because she has a bandana. She's got binoculars, and she's got a rosy glow. And her companion there is a filmmaker and a photographer, and you could obviously trust him. Look at that. And they're going to have information for you about wild creatures and conservation. You're going to trust them, and that's a very well-worn trunk line of conservation communication there through BBC Wildlife Magazine, National Geographic, myriad forms of communication that work. But I'm here to tell you, there are people that don't get charmed by this approach. They don't care about the sad-eyed panda in the back of the magazine. They don't even notice it because they care about other things. Obviously, there's a million sectors that we might try and target, but the one that I decided to target was design. Now, this is a second couple. This is Cheryl Stauffer and her partner, whose name she never mentions, even though she always looks exactly that lovingly at him in all pictures. And she/they have the Crimson Design Group. And rather than looking at chimps in Guinea, they are looking stylish on a sofa in Columbus, Ohio. And you might not have met these creatures in the wild, But they're interior designers, and they work with high net worth individuals to create these wonderful interior environments. And they have a lot of money, changes hands, and they are almost like therapists with their clients. They find out what they love and they create these wonderful worlds for them. And often the part of that is, so that this is me, is sort of translating from the left-hand tribe and then trying to take conservation information to the right-hand side of that picture. This is another interior designer. He's called Carlos Mota, and his book there is called Beige is Not a Color. So he loves biodiversity, he loves color. He has absolutely no idea really of science or anything. So he is my target audience. I want to work with people who love color and are interested but don't feel confident to maybe go there. This is an interior designer and resort owner that I do work with in Mexico. She's got a beautiful couple of different resorts there, and that's a mock-up on the bottom there of a bedhead that she's doing with me. It's a Mexican resort, and it's a Mexican design all about wild species. And I love the opportunity to also do bespoke work for people like that, where they have a site somewhere and I can do the research about all the wild species in that area and turn it into something that her clients can really enjoy, or his or her clients, and also learn about and really engage with the stories of those species. So I take my field notes and my illustrations and my drawings and my ability to not be scared of the science, and I go in and do research and create designs which they then use and hopefully try and maximize the communication of the ideas and the messaging. I just want to give a few examples. Textiles have been used for propaganda from time immemorial. You go back and look in many different cultures, and there's a lot of information that is transmitted through designs. My friend Marilyn's got a beautiful huipil from Guatemala on, and I'm not able to particularly read any of the iconography. It looks like it's a lot of roses and stuff, but there tend to be all kinds of symbols and messages about fertility and the rainy season and various things that are going on in those things. And communication through textiles is part of the fabric of life going through many cultures and millennia. But in some recent examples, the Chinese Revolution, length of cloth from the year of my birth, and that's really a propaganda pattern. And you might not even be able to see it, but there's, for them, with their iconography, there's flags there of people marching and tiny little crowds, and that will be very resonant in that area. Again, this is a Soviet collectivization, agitation textile, 19th and 20s and 30s. There are loads of these, and they're absolutely brilliant, graphically brilliant, and they were encouraging people to all feel part of things, and not just by a poster that you'd see on the wall, but by textiles and design that you'd have upholstered on your sofa or things you'd wear, and that brings it into the home and into the heart in a way that is special. This is a Nigerian tree planting bit of a propaganda textile just from recently. I can't tell you exactly what it says there, but you can see the ladies have got their wood for their stoves, but they've also holding up little trees that they're going to be planting in order to have a forest that's sustainable for their community. So I want to be in that tradition. I want to be in a tradition of communicating through the textiles. And so I started this business. So this goes back now 3.5 years. This is a design that I did on my cloud forest experience. So I actually recycled the illustrations that I did when I was in the field studying the bears. I tend to show my designs like that, where you can really see the balance of the design, because I really like it. That's the most important thing for me, is to see how it balances. And I'm very proud in that design of how you have those sort of interleaving mountain ridges, and it gives that sense of depth, and things appearing out from behind clouds, which is the way that environment was for me. And here it is in the home of a friend of mine who's a rug designer, who always does great things with it. This is another sort of colorway, so my designs tend to have different colorways. I thought I would just take a moment to tell you something kind of funny about the way the design process works. Because I am a conservation biologist, I still have my card. I do like to get things roughly right in terms of how I represent things, but sometimes I have to make choices that are purely aesthetic and that don't have any justification really other than that. And this is one example. So the guy who's the furthest right of the full-bodied He's called the hooded mountain toucan. And if you notice in this design, he's colourful. I drew him from nature, so I was actually looking at him, but there is one change that I made. I don't know if you can see, I can't point properly, but there's a flash of red plumage around about his bum. And my advisors at the time were like, wow, I like this design, it's all really good, but I think that bird has been shot in the bum. And someone else said to me, I think that bird's menstruating. I was like, no, we can't have a menstruating bird. I'm going to have to change that. So my bird has no shock of bright red plumage, and perhaps I use a little bit of artful disguise there, but I do sometimes find myself having to make decisions that are not biologically faithful. This is my most recent design. My last name is Paisley. My mother's family name was Newton, and my dad's was Paisley. So in a way, it's kind of an example of nominative determinism that I make sciencey patterns now. And this is one all about microscopic life, microorganisms. The largest is that nudibranch. You might be able to recognize the sort of red, white, and blue type of creature. But there's lots of copepods, algae, amoebas, and there's paramecia, which for me, somebody once said to me, I said, I'm a biologist called Paisley, and they said, well, you should be called paramecia then, that they were paying attention in their science class, but it's sort of a teardrop shape. Very geeky. No one knows what I'm on about. They all think it's like Paisley paracetamol. People call me up and want to. I'm like, oh, that's not the name. But I talk in the literature that I provide about it about the great importance of microorganisms and plankton for the planet that we live in, and the importance of their ability to store carbon and whatnot. Again, different iterations of that, and more copepods, and that pink sort of shoe is a paramecium there, and a little tardigrade is peeking above the edge there. And this is it in use in a house. I think it looks quite different from my other designs, and it's wonderful because I can really experiment with colour. Usually I'm fairly faithful, little patch of bum feathers notwithstanding, but I'm generally pretty faithful to the way they look in nature. Oops. If I do escape, will the world end?
No.
Okay, good. For all of my designs, I tend to do a pollinator print, which is where I take out a certain element of the design and highlight the ecological importance of different pollinators. And from my rainforest print, this was another recent one that I did. It's about the high Andean hummingbirds, and those sort of puffball-looking things are called Puya raimondi, and they are very, very tall indeed, 10-meter flower stalk, and they flower once every 100 years with millions of flowers which are pollinated by hummingbirds, and then they die. So they're very interesting. And with that whole high Andean stuff, it wasn't particularly the endangerment of the particular species that I focused on, but more what global warming and climate chaos and whatnot, that havoc it's wreaking on those very fragile, finely calibrated systems. This is it in use. And here it is on a sofa in front of a beautiful house where I was married. Nigel was there, Bob was there back in the day, and went back and did some photography of a photo shoot there with a wonderful company called Howard that's been making chairs for a great many years. And here it is on wallpaper, just to give you an idea. This is a design called Lewa Union, which was, I know some of you will know Jonathan Bailey. And Jonathan was married at Lewa, which is a wonderful reserve in Kenya, overlooking Mount Kenya, and it was full moon at their wedding. So this was my wedding gift to them, this present. Jonathan's now chief scientist at National Geographic. We're all very impressed. And but where we had our office together back in the day in the Institute of Zoology, there were naked mole rats on in the pictures on the way up the stairs, and that was always a source of hilarity and whatnot. But I think it was kind of the basis for this. The whole design is pretty much about Myrmecophagous species, and this is another example of me kind of pulling together things that ecologically there's some story I can tell. That there's the amazing symbiosis of the ants, biting ants on the whistling thorn, acacia, and the aardwolf, the little doggy thing there, which is again depends on termites and the hornbills eating one there and stuff. So they're stories that are fun to tell, but I do think it's the only ever representation of naked mole rat in textile design in the history of the world. There it is in use. When I'm doing these designs and doing this work, I think about how can I measure the success, and I think about, well, it's important that there's commercial success, and I do achieve some commercial success and critical success, and I've been lucky to win some awards for the work. But very importantly is the fact that for every meter of fabric I sell and every roll of wallpaper, I'm able to preserve 100 square meters of wild habitat through Wild Land Trust. So there's a real, visual sense that you can look at your curtains and think 100 times that much roughly has been saved through Wild Land Trust, and they've been wonderful to work with, and I really love the areas where they buy land, and I hope long may that continue as a relationship because I love supporting them. Additionally, the conservation communication aspect of it is very important to me, and particularly this year I'm really focusing more on trying to write and communicate about the conservation side of things. This is a design that's based on the Lorax, which people know the Lorax? Some people know the Lorax? It's a wonderful children's story by Dr. Seuss. And my husband is an actor, and he was in a musical of the Lorax, and I wanted to do this design as my little homage to that. And I always used to teach this, working with kids and stuff when I was younger, the story of the Lorax, looking after the trees. So these are my real-world English equivalents of the Makey-uppy species and the Lorax. Like the red squirrels there were my barbaloots, and the Lorax himself is that nightingale shouting about looking after the trees, and humming fish were the great crested newts. You, Brett? And but I'd like you to look at this design for a moment, and then tell me what is wrong. What's happened between? It's a different color, right? But what is the difference between this design and this design? That's right. And that happened because one of my clients said, oh, as a young couple, they love your work, they want your work, so excited, their first home. Could you lose the squirrels? They're phobic about squirrels. Phobic about squirrels, okay, all right. So I sort of made some jokes about defaunation and sending out the pest control and whatever. And then the next thing I knew, they wanted to get rid of the newts. And so far, I'm hanging on to the bees and the birds. I've got the snail had to go. I had a snail in there which was extinct for ages and then found again in Chichester Harbour. The lagoon spire snail, it was called. Very inoffensive. Need to lose him. So anyway, I've drawn the line now. That's it. I'm not losing any more. There's various compositions. There's various colorways. I think I now have something like 75 or so different iterations, different, not whole different designs. But this, for example, is a reworking of certain design elements. It's called Carolina Posies, and it's commercially been quite successful. This one. On this cushion are Pollinator Print to do with monarch butterflies and the milkweed and echinacea, and then the Carolina Posies, and then the one on the right is about bees, about the short-haired bee that was reintroduced into the UK. Those are very easy for people to use, and they're very commercially good. But I just wanted to finish with this. This is the Carolina Tree of Life. It was the first design that I ever did. My father lives in North Carolina. My mother was from North Carolina, and I lived there for many years and love it. And so this was my love song to that part of the world. It's got a lot of different design elements in it that have various different levels of endangerment. You might recognize the Carolina parakeet, which went extinct in the wild in 1918. And then the last one died after that in the same cage where Martha, the passenger pigeon, died. There were millions of them, and their population crashed because of trees being cut down. Also, they had a flocking behavior where when one was shot, they would all come and to the injured or dead member of their flock, so it's possible to wipe them out. There may have been illness. They're interesting creatures because they ate cockleburs, which are the things that parrots are about to eat there, which had a poison in it. I think it's called a glucoside. I don't know what that means exactly. Poisonous, something to do with sugars. And anyway, when the birds ate the cockleburs all the time, and if cats ate, Audubon noted, if the cats ate the birds would die. So they had a certain immunity from predation probably, but it wasn't enough for the guns and the forest being cut down. This was my first design, and I did it all in one piece of paper, one work of art, which I exhibited in Whitstable, and ended up, my friend has that now in her home. Subsequently, I do them in different ways, but it was a very interesting process working out that composition. And when I do the designs, I always provide information for the people that buy the designs. It can be as simple as this kind of thing, which is just a card that labels the different species in the design and tells a little bit the story. But sometimes I go for it and I do a full kind of infographic styled up to look like some kind of old field notes or something. But I always imagine I'm going to do those for everything, but they actually take more time than I usually have, given that there's no particular remunerative benefit to doing them. But I like the fact that I'm trying to tell the stories about these amazing species. But I just wanted to point out one thing to finish with. You guys, maybe perhaps some people have noticed something in there that, yes?
Extinction Rebellion.
Extinction Rebellion. So I did this design in 2016. I knew of that symbol, but it wasn't anywhere in the mainstream at all. So I wanted to carve it on this little tree. Now this design has gone out all over the place and is in the homes of some very well-to-do, frankly, non-friendly towards Extinction Rebellion type people. And what I wanted to finish with really in bringing that up is that I sort of imagine a kind of a graph where on the x-axis, say you've got, I just like to tag Charlie Gardner as a marvelous article that he wrote in The Guardian about Extinction Rebellion and the need for scientists to be activists as well. And this is sort of agreeing with him there, that if you've got an x-axis where you've got, on the left is just being safe with your data, keeping your head down, equivalent with design would be, oh, it's very pretty, but a bit concerned about it, but that's fine. And then on the right-hand side is your hair's on fire, you're strapping yourself to a bridge and, stopping tube journeys. And then on your y-axis, you've got your craziest wacky talents you might have, like playing the kazoo or making loom bands, and it would be completely irrelevant to conservation. At the bottom, you've got your core abilities. I think there's a sweet spot where all of us can bring in different talents and different abilities and different enthusiasms, passions that we have in order to make a difference and really win hearts and minds and perhaps scalps and get donors and advocates out there in the world. And I do think that that branching a little bit out of our safety zone into the realms of activism and art and creativity is powerful. And with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and any questions I'd be delighted to answer.